So, welcome to DCTP.tv, Philip Banse from Republica 2019. My next guest is Alex Rosenblat. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, Philip.
You wrote a book about Uber and how it is to work for an app, if your app is your boss.
Mm-hmm.
And you talked a lot to Uber drivers,
Yes.
right? So, what is so special about having an app as an Uber driver telling you where to go, when to go, how much you earn or you have earned? What's so special about this relationship?
Well, one feature of this relationship is that Uber says drivers are actually their own boss, that they're entrepreneurs. And you might presume from that drivers can make informed decisions about the trips they take. They might choose a more profitable trip over a less profitable one. But actually, an algorithmic boss enacts the rules of how you should behave on the job. It leverages quite a lot of control over the decisions you can make and the information you have and the power you have. And that finding that drivers do in fact have a boss, it's an algorithmic one, has been the center of disputes in the United States and around the world about whether drivers are classified appropriately as independent contractors who are in business for themselves, or whether they should be classified as an employee, for example. So effectively, Uber is using technology to exclude workers from the benefits of employment law, like a minimum wage, through an algorithmic explanation for what transpires on the job. And the myth of algorithms is that they are neutral. They simply facilitate and curate everything from the services we consume to the news we see to the dispatching of drivers. And what I found in my work is that there's a whole lot of ways that Uber can exert control and sometimes manipulation over both the driver experience and the passenger experience.
Can you provide an example for that, for the manipulation of the drivers?
Sure. For example, Travis Kalanick, Uber's former CEO, used to describe the surge pricing algorithm, where the prices rise when the supply of drivers in a local area is lower than the passenger demand for them. And he said, well, we simply have the technology to reflect the conditions of the marketplace. It supports Uber's argument that it is just a neutral, hands-off intermediary, like a credit card processor, for facilitating interaction. Sort of similar to how Facebook says we simply connect
People
billions of
around the
users.
world,
And yet there's a latent recognition that it has quite a lot of power, and governing powers at that. And so let's say the driver is aware of the surge pricing. Why? Because Uber sent notices to the driver saying, there's high demand now. If you relocate to this place at this time, you'll earn a premium, maybe 2 times, maybe 9 times as much as you would normally earn. Some drivers describe this as a herding tool. Although over time, drivers start to let each other know, don't chase the surge, because they recognize that the algorithmic manager can be deceiving. Let's say you relocate to the surge pricing zone. There's no guarantee the surge will still be in effect by the time you arrive.
Yeah.
And Uber might even dispatch you a ride that's outside of the surge zone. One driver received an email from Uber after he canceled a ride that was the base rates, because he said, I took on the time and costs and lost opportunity to arrive here. I want a premium ride. And so the next day, Uber wrote and said, you're accused of surge manipulation. You're trying to take advantage of surge. If you continue to do this, we may deactivate you. We might fire you. You start to see how Uber's using, the guise of neutral control to actually affect specific behaviors on drivers.
All right. Just another example of the power of Uber.
And for passengers too. Computer scientists Li Chen and Alan Mislov and Christo Wilson at Northeastern University found that 2 passengers in the same surge zone might receive a different multiplier. So Philip gets a trip that's 2 times the price, and Alex gets one that's 3 times the price. We're standing right next to each other. So what you're seeing is that under the guise of sort of a neutral algorithms, you're actually experiencing price discrimination. There's nothing especially new, unique, or even necessarily wrong with price discrimination, but Uber has used technology to narrate what you see as something that's quite different. They've reshaped the narrative of what they're doing.
And how far is this an example for other, areas of work? I mean, this is ride sharing. Okay, there are They don't share much, but we call it ride sharing.
Now we call it ride hailing.
Oh, okay, ride hailing. And how far is this this boss worker relationship an example for a bigger problem?
Well, in one sense, you can argue that because of Uber's model and the precedent it sets, even if the company disappears tomorrow, the legal battles over how it works and what's legal about it will set a precedent for employers across the United States and elsewhere as these disputes resolve, because maybe you can forego the obligations an employer might owe to their to their employee if you can classify them as an independent contractor, but still continue to standardize the services they provide. In other ways, though, I think the different features of gig economy work are spreading in different ways. It might be that an online marketplace that doesn't exert the kinds of control Uber does, like Care.com, still uses a rating system and a ranking system and such to promote, care workers who need to seek out work to try and message back and forth with future employers or families. But they're not taking all of it. With Uber, the dispatcher just gets you the ride. And for Care.com, you're messaging, it's more like online dating. It's like you're messaging back and forth to get the trip. But in other ways, Uber's not just setting a precedent for employment. If you think about it, Uber is setting the rates for millions of independent contractors. So either it's misclassifying millions of independent contractors, or it's coordinating prices for millions of small independent businesses, which might be a violation of antitrust laws. So then Uber would have to sort of convince any antitrust authorities that there's actually a sufficient consumer benefit and welfare from this system of algorithmic price fixing, And so
interesting view, yeah.
Right, so there's not just one, it's that Uber has blurred the lines of its operations by saying what you see is not exactly what it is, and we should perceive this as something different. It's able to distort the facts through the explanations of technology, and that's setting a much bigger cultural precedent.
That's right. And what did the drivers tell you about being de facto an employee of an app, of a smartphone app, and you don't really know how this app behaves? Uber does some experiments, changes prices here but not there. How is it communicated to the drivers how the app behaves?
Well, a lot of the communications drivers receive are indirect, because if they tell drivers, here's the employee handbook, here's how you must behave, and here are the rules, it would look like a relationship between an employee and an employer, not simply with an independent contractor. So many of these changes and rules are communicated through the language of suggestion and nudges. Little prompts that your app notifies you, do this, do that. Hi, we've been measuring how quickly you accelerate, how harshly you brake. To improve your behavior, do the following. And so there's these ways in which drivers have less true independence, but that's not even necessarily the crux of the issue. They don't know what the rules are, and they have to sort it out within the system of suggestion. And while not all nudges are enforceable, the rating system often acts as an enforcement tool for the suggestions, because if you behave in a way that defies how Uber has scaffolded expectations and the passenger gives you a low rating, Uber will terminate or threaten to terminate your employment if your rating falls below a certain minimum threshold. So there's ways in which the control that's enacted through a more traditional employment relationship reappear in these different ways. But a really vital piece of this information asymmetry is that it creates a collective uncertainty about what the rules are. Uber drivers are experimented on, just like Silicon Valley platforms experiment on their users all of the time. I think back to when Facebook published the results of an emotional contagion study. To some users, they displayed sadder posts, and to others, they selected happier posts. And they wanted to study the effects of the spread of that emotion. And when they published that study, consumers were outraged because they
felt like guinea pigs.
Exactly. And it also contradicted the idea that the algorithms that curate your newsfeed are simply neutral. There's no visible human editor there sort of saying, I show you this sometimes and I show you that. It's really been cultivated under the myth of algorithmic neutrality. And Uber brought a very similar myth, but also the practices of experimentation to the driver workplace. In 2016, drivers started to notice something funny. They had contracts and an understanding that they would remit back to Uber, let's say 25% of what the passenger paid.
Yeah.
With fees, so usually like 30%. But that's the understanding. Suddenly they noticed that The passenger maybe paid $90 and the driver earned $30. What was happening? They crowdsourced comparisons between their pay stubs and the passenger's receipts in person and online to find that Uber had actually changed the pricing policy without notifying drivers. This was just another experiment. And so you have to wonder, when it comes to the world of work, how are the practices of algorithms and experimentation starting to fragment your expectations of your employer and create a constant environment of anxiety over when the next change is going to take place?
And do you have any idea how to enforce any transparency in this system?
I think, for one, setting minimum standards for workers would do a great deal. New York City recently intervened and said, you can continue to experiment, Uber, Lyft, Juno, and other ride-hailing companies, but you have to pay drivers a minimum wage. They call it a minimum pay rate because the drivers are still independent contractors. So drivers need to earn, after their expenses, $17.22 US per hour, which is roughly the independent contractor equivalent to a $15 minimum wage. And it doesn't stop Uber and Lyft from competing for drivers through incentives and bonuses and other bait, but it sets a standard. And so you don't just have sort of this deterioration within a structure of uncertainty.
Okay, and this is one regulatory approach to that. Do you have the feeling that all the downsides you mentioned of this employer-employee relationship, which is very new and app-based and algorithmically moderated, do you think that all those downsides can be mitigated by government regulations? Is it just a question of will, so that the government has to say, well, we want to regulate that, and we have this parameter and this parameter and this parameter, and we can do it? Or is it is this system, this algorithmic-based system, not able to being regulated by this kind of regulations?
Well, I don't think that regulators have come to a common conclusion over what this employment relationship is. In Alaska and Texas, the states pass laws after significant lobbying to codify driver status as independent contractors, but state law doesn't preempt federal law, so the National Labor Relations Act might bear on a different set of findings for the exact same fact pattern. At the same time, the Unemployment Benefit Board in New York City determined that drivers are employees for the purpose of getting unemployment benefits. So there's not a coherent interpretation of the facts, but beyond that, I would say that there's a risk, of course, that Uber sails through variable interventions because it's so successful at narrating a technological difference to the power it's able to enact. And that's a good representation, or perhaps example or metaphor, of lots of different ways that platforms are starting to usher in new forms of governance, where regulation, although it is appealing as the next, fortification, may not be enough. And in the United States, I think elected officials are starting to respond to that sense of unease that power is seeping away. They don't necessarily have the same name for it. Senator Ted Cruz will say, this is a free speech issues. Google and Twitter and Facebook, they're regulating free speech, and, we think they have an anti-conservative bias. Whereas Senator Elizabeth Warren, a presidential candidate, might say, the issue is antitrust. We need to break up big tech, and that will create a better environment of innovation. And so what you're looking at is almost like the political body's biological response to the power that seems to have seeped away and accrued by platforms in the face of a myth and culture that suggests that all of this is simply neutral and apolitical in the first place. And so while regulatory intervention is certainly very important, I also start to wonder whether platforms are not ushering in a new form of governance using the language of technology to deflect and change how we shape the narrative.
What do you mean?
Well, let me give you one example. Uber and Lyft too say they're not transportation companies, and therefore they're not obliged to provide accessible services under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Uber also says we're valued at about $91 billion, but we lose money every year. We lost $1.8 billion in 2018. So here we are, an unprofitable ride-hail company, and we want investors and the public to believe that we hold the keys to the future as a transportation company. What kind of a vision is it where you can say, we're not really a transportation company when it comes to the law, but we are the future if you buy into the progressive myths of technology determinism. And so that's where I start to wonder.
You would call it. No?
Well, I think it's distorting the facts and reshaping the narratives. And I think in my years of studying Uber and in writing this book, how algorithms are rewriting the rules of work, what I've seen is a lot of ideological developments in how technology is used to amass power and deflect attention from the power it holds.
Alex, thank you so much. The book is called Uberland. You can show it here. It's available already? Or
It's already available. It came out in October.
All
You
right.
can get it from your local bookstore or online.
All right. Thank you very much, Alex, for your time.
Thank
you
you
very
so
much for
much.
watching. You find the video on YouTube or dcdb.tv. Thank you very much for watching. Bye.